Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life. Welcome all you hoidle-doidles and bottens-glottens and schlogengruppens and assemblage-blabens. Let's try that again. Hey you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and think I'm a believer's welcome. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. I think we better put that in English. It's a little easier to understand. Thanks for downloading me today. I thought about abbreviating download to deload, and then I thought, I wonder if that has some vulgar connotation in pop culture. Sure enough, I definitely do not want to use deload. So, thanks for just downloading the UU today. I hope you know you certainly don't have to agree with everything I say. Now, of course, I want you to agree with every single thing I say. Sheesh, I'm not making this stuff up. I'm following careful, often big-shot scholars for most of what I process with you. Much of what I say I've been teaching for many years, so that now I think what I'm saying is original to me. So, goodness, yes, I want you hanging on every phrase, every syllable. But honestly, I'd rather you had your brain turned on and that you'd be thinking critically with me. That's more important to me than your fealty to my vast wisdom. We have too many sheeple in society who slurp down whatever the party line is instead of folks who, in a mood of generosity, nevertheless think critically about what they ingest. Okay, opening salvo completed. Let's turn our brains on. This is number 2 in my series on heaven and hell, and today's episode could well help to frame your hope in Christ's resurrection and eternal kingdom. The hope that we have in Christ is quite distinct from the Old Testament teaching on what happens at and after death. So come on with me here. Let's start drinking from a fire hose. Let's take a probing look at the Old Testament and the afterlife. First, why study the Old Testament? Well, since it's the New Testament that far and away reveals the most about the afterlife, some may well wonder why would we even look at the Old Testament? And the answer is first that it's worthwhile to consider how the ancient Hebrews thought, or didn't think, about the afterlife. Secondly, and for Christians more importantly, we study it because the Old Testament is the background that informed the worldview of Jesus and the apostles. They were Jews. They read, memorized, and worshipped using the Old Testament. It's the formative background. It provides a huge grist for the culture that informs the New Testament. Secondly, we would look at the Old Testament. Well, thank you for that. Just messed. Here we go. Secondly, I want you to know that there's variety concerning the afterlife in the Old Testament. And in part, this is because the Old Testament itself is the product of many centuries worth of writers. And those writers lived in quite varied socioeconomic, cultural, and religious contexts. And those contexts obviously played a part in the formation of their thought. As theologians, we do well to remember that God always speaks to and through people in their respective eras and historical cultural locations. So we're going to see that there's variety in the way the Old Testament viewed the afterlife. And we should also add that in the Old Testament, the afterlife is consistently described with metaphors and analogies and images. Now, this means we cannot press the images and metaphors too far. We can't try to make them mean too much. We shouldn't take them as one-for-one literals. Nevertheless, through these images, we learn as much about the ancient attitudes toward death as we do about their actual beliefs about death. Oh, and if you're a true nerd, an important book I used for this study was by Philip Johnston, Shades of Sheol, Death and Afterlife in the Old Testament. I'm going to be drawing extensively from his book in today's episode. Johnston teaches at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. Now let me give you some Old Testament terms for the netherworld, the world of the dead. The first is kaber. Say kaber, class. Teacher. Just means the grave or the burial site. People with means, people with money, buried their dead in tombs or family-owned caves, but the poor simply dug a hole in the ground and covered their dead with soil. We see this in Genesis 23:4, 2 Kings 22:20, Judges 2:10. Kaber, the grave. They thought about the place of the dead in light of the grave. Similarly, there is the Hebrew word shakat, means a pit. It appears in phrases like go down to the pit in Job 33:24 or Psalm 30:10, 55:24, Ezekiel 28:8. It's found in phrases like to approach the pit, Job 33:22, or to die into the pit, Isaiah 51:4. So there's a sense of lowliness, dirt. It's just a place where, where the body would be buried. So at a very basic level, the site, the hole, the grave, where bodies would be buried, shaped how Old Testament Jews thought about the afterlife, which means there's not much to it. Place of the dead is where that body went. But there's another more sophisticated term, Sheol. Say Sheol, class. Sheol, teacher. Sheol gets us into a little more depth about the Old Testament view on the afterlife. The Hebrew origin and etymology are uncertain. Some scholars think that perhaps it was derived from Akkadian. But the Old Testament's most common term for the place of the dead is Sheol, and it occurs only 66 times in the Old Testament across that huge span of Old Testament history. It especially appears in reflective literature. So, for example, the Psalms, Job, Proverbs. Literature where people are considering their destiny and reflecting emotionally on the end of their lives, thinking about what life means. Now, Sheol very rarely occurs in descriptive narratives. When we come through those narratives, we don't have stories that reveal or describe where the dead king's or the prophet's soul went or what happened there. And again, we see that this points to the kind of metaphorical, poetic use of language concerning the afterlife. It's kind of uncertain. They didn't know, we don't know what was going on there. Sometimes Sheol just means the grave. Sometimes it refers to the place where the dead reside. It's not always clear whether Sheol means just the grave or the netherworld, the place of the dead. Who goes or who went? Who goes to the netherworld? Who goes to the place of the dead if we look across the Old Testament? Well, everyone. Everyone who dies goes there. Psalm 89, 48 through 49, Ecclesiastes 9, 7 through 10. Everyone goes there. And while there are texts that say even the righteous go there, usually the righteous are spoken about with reference to Sheol as it concerns an untimely death. So sometimes they will use the word Sheol as though it means a kind of divine punishment. An untimely death is a divine punishment. And we see that in places like Genesis 37:35, Isaiah 38:10, Job 17:13 through 16, and Psalm 88:4. Hope you wrote those down rather quickly. Great thing about a podcast, you can back it up. Often, the righteous in the Old Testament refer to their time. We want to put air quotes around time. They'll refer to their time in Sheol in the poetic terms of lamentation. So sometimes they'll talk about being in Sheol, and it's kind of like saying, it was hell during that time of my life. How's life, Shmuley? Thanks for asking, Reuben. It stinks like Sheol right now. My wife left me, my dog left me, and even the cow's milk is dried up. I feel like I'm living in Sheol. So sometimes Sheol's this poetic term, or used in poetic ways. It just means life stinks. In other parts of the Old Testament, the people who go to Sheol are any deceased inhabitant. And sometimes we get warnings, say in Psalms and Proverbs, about those who follow foolishness. They can end up in Sheol. Now, also, I was shocked to learn in Johnson's book, again, Shades of Sheol, that Baptists who reject the Reformed doctrine of limited atonement also go to Sheol. And I find that ironic. The crazy thing, Johnson said, other Christians, charismatics, foursquares, Church of God types, even non-denominational types, well, they still go to heaven if they reject limited atonement. But if you're Baptist and you reject that doctrine, you lose your limited status of election. Yes, I'm easily amused by theological humor. And no, Johnson didn't say that. I just thought it'd be funny to throw that in there. Sheol is also, or maybe especially, occupied by the uncircumcised. That is, those outside of the covenant community. Or we would call them, the Old Testament calls them the ungodly, the wicked. In fact, 1/2 of all the occurrences that use Sheol in the Old Testament pertain to its being the destiny of the ungodly. Numbers 16:30 and 33, Proverbs 5:5, Job 24:19, 1 Kings 2:6 and 9, Isaiah 5:14, Ezekiel 31:18, Ezekiel 32:17 through 32. A place to describe where the ungodly, where the wicked go. So to share death with the uncircumcised was understood to be shameful, like sharing death with vile and unclean persons. You didn't want to be next to them in the netherworld. You didn't want to think of associating with them in the netherworld. Now, those who go to Sheol, the dead, are called the shades, Rephaim. Say Rephaim, class. Rephaim, teacher. The shades, the Rephaim, they have being, but not as we experience it. They have existence in Sheol, but certainly not as we experience it here on earth. They are inactive. And it's important to point out with this issue of the dead being inactive is that makes the ancient Israelites very unique among their Middle Eastern neighbors, because their surrounding neighbors tried to consult with or seek protection from or get blessing from or power from the dead. And even sometimes the dead ancestors in other cultures were thought of as gods. But for the ancient Hebrews, the dead are inactive. They cannot harm or help living people. When we run into that story in 1 Samuel, in fact, it's the only Old Testament story of necromancy, consulting the dead. The only Old Testament story where we see that happening is in 1 Samuel 28 when Saul consults the spirit of the dead Samuel through the witch at Endor. And this story is told to point out the problems with necromancy, not to encourage it. Because for Saul, the fact that he consulted the witch to seek out Samuel only sealed Saul's fate. So the ancient Jews were unique for believing that the dead are inactive. They can't harm or help. We're not to consult them. Well, what's the function of Sheol? In the Old Testament, Sheol functions as the extreme opposite of the heights of heaven. In Job 11, Psalm 55, Amos 9. And often those those in Sheol are separated from Yahweh. Psalm 6:6, Isaiah 38:18, Jonah 2:5. Those who go to Sheol are forgotten. Perhaps in poetic literature there in Psalm 88:5. And in Psalm 88:12, Sheol is called the land of forgetfulness. There's no return from Sheol, Job 16:22. So when you go there, it's easy to be forgotten, and it's not hard to get our imaginations around how we can feel like within two generations we ourselves won't be remembered, right? I think some of that's being read into those references of Sheol there. Interestingly, though, Yahweh can both know about Sheol and go there. One cannot escape Yahweh by going there. Amos 9:2, Psalm 139:8. Sheol, for all of its shadowy nature, it nevertheless lies open to Yahweh. Job 26:5, Proverbs 15:11. God's power is not limited there. Isaiah 7, Job 11, Amos 9, Isaiah 7. Oh, I got that twice. But what this means is that Yahweh has access to Sheol, even though Sheol's inhabitants do not have access to him. They're dead, they're inactive, but God is omnipresent, God is powerful, God has authority. He can go there if he wants. So Sheol is occupied by the wicked, but it's interesting that the Old Testament does not describe punishment after death. What we find in Old Testament verses are passages about dishonor and shame, about going to Sheol and living or being or lying there in dishonor and shame. But the Old Testament doesn't describe punishment after death. That idea will develop in the intertestamental period, a period that I will unpack and describe further in my next episode. So let's do an overview of Sheol. The pre-Christian Israelites were focused more on the here and now than on the afterlife. Johnson wrote, "The ancient Israel goal was to enjoy a long, full life, secure in the knowledge of God's presence, and rich in the blessings that attend a life of covenant faithfulness. Furthermore, inasmuch as children were viewed to be extensions of the lives of their parents, eternal life was often viewed in terms of living on in one's children. So, a man, quote, with a full quiver, Psalm 127, was considered most blessed. A person who was childless was deemed under the curse, end quote. So the focus of those ancient Hebrews was on this life and having children, because children carry your identity on, children remember you, and it's a blessing to have those children. Also, along with the notion of Sheol, the ancient Hebrews believed that the universe existed in or as three tiers. So at the top of these tiers was heaven, where God resided with his court. And then there's earth, obviously the residence of humankind and all the animals. And then there's Sheol, the residence of the dead. And often that was thought to be located deep in the earth. It's amazing, it's interesting to me that I think huge chunks of Western reality, Western civilization, still think of it this way. Heaven, earth, the place of the dead, kind of in a descending hierarchy, 3 different tiers. Other ancient non-Hebrew people groups also believed in that 3-tiered universe, although they often believed that multiple gods inhabited heaven as well as the place of the dead. And then a difference between the ancient Hebrews and other people groups was that the Hebrews were not much concerned about what happened to the deceased in the afterlife, as we said before. And that's interesting because even the Egyptians, who had many books, including the Book of the Dead, they would describe souls' journeys into the underworld and then even offer up information about some who returned from it. But for those Hebrews, it was a shadowy place, a place about which not much can be said. Obviously, death was the means of entrance into Sheol, and sometimes death was described as falling asleep in the land of the living and awakening in the netherworld. It was understood to be the normal end of life, right? Ecclesiastes 3:2. There's a time to be born and a time to die. But when we say that, we shouldn't think that that meant the ancient Jews welcomed death, because it was viewed as separation from this life and even as an enemy. Psalm 55:4, the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Psalm 49:14, like sheep they are appointed for Sheol, death shall be their shepherd. Psalm 18:4 and following, the cords of death encompassed me, the torrents of perdition assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. And again, we can say, wow, were they thinking literally that way, or are they just saying, man, my life really stinks, the cow's milk dried up? But they weren't looking forward to death. Isaiah in 25:7 looked forward to the day when death would be no more. Whether that was literal or a hope or poetic, there are probably layers there. But in the Psalms at least, an untimely or premature death was seen as a bitter enemy. Death could also be viewed as a means of punishment. The Old Testament speaks especially of the wicked this way. Johnson writes that prior to the flood, God reduced the average lifespan to 120 years as the punishment for illicit marriage. Whatever we make of those lifespans there in early Genesis, right? But the flood itself destroyed nearly all of humanity for its sinfulness, so we can see death there as a kind of punishment. Death as a means of punishment is evident with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, or the rebellious leaders in the wilderness in Exodus 32, or an entire Exodus generation being evil in Numbers 14. All of those were punished by God with death, and God even instructed the death penalty for certain offenses, especially the taking of human life. It's interesting how there's so much correlation. We can see how some of that carries forward into today, how death is viewed as a punishment, whether naturally or through societal means, right? In some Old Testament passages, the physical body was dead, but the deceased continued to live or to exist as living corpses. Again, Raphaim, shades. So the body's dead, but the deceased exist, are in Sheol. It doesn't, we have to be careful here because it doesn't mean the dead could converse with one another. Sometimes death is described as a kind of reunion with departed ones in Psalm 49 and Ezekiel 32, but even in those passages, there's no sense that they enjoy a happy reunion or a meaningful interaction. Sheol is a place of inactivity and darkness. So there's not a lot of thought about the afterlife. It has a lot to do with dishonor or honor, whether one was wicked or one was righteous or one was in covenant. But in all of this, the ancient Israelites did not look forward to the afterlife. Even the phrases we find in Genesis repeatedly, quote, gathered to his peoples, slept with his fathers, those are flowery language for he died peacefully. And when people talk, right, about death, we use euphemisms, nice ways to soften the starkness of the situation. We like to use different words to soften the starkness of death. So they weren't looking forward to the afterlife in the era of the Old Testament. Shout outs. Hey, please help me. Please consider making a monthly Patreon pledge. Please consider making a one-time pledge to Patreon. I would love to buy another microphone so that I can do interviews much more easily. A couple times I've done interviews with Dr. McNutt and Dr. Ostring, we're sharing a microphone, and another microphone would make that so much more feasible, doable. Please keep making those Facebook shares. I really appreciate that. Those shares put the show in front of folks that I cannot easily access. And hey, you want to hit me up for one of my 3-inch by 7-inch UU bumper stickers? Contact me at the Uncensored Unprofessor at gmail.com. Thanks, you guys. I really appreciate your support. I really appreciate you helping me promote the show, and I truly appreciate your prayers. Ezekiel 32, 17 through 32 is unique across the sweep of the Old Testament as it concerns Sheol. Now, like the rest of the Old Testament, it posits that the existence of the dead was a shadowy one, but it is interesting because it suggests that the dead were fully conscious. The dead are aware that their conduct on earth had determined their status among the dead. Ezekiel 32 shows that God's justice was fulfilled by where the dead were placed, in positions of honor or dishonor and shame. But again, scholars say we have to be careful because that may be poetic or metaphoric to express the ultimate justice that will be eventually wrought. And that may be poetic talk about the way that people should feel over their own evil doing. Maybe Ezekiel 32 is a way to express that we should feel shame for our evil when it pulls it into themes on the afterlife. I think it's interesting to know, and my students were surprised the many times I taught on this topic, is that despite the many centuries that are included across the Old Testament writings, ideas of the resurrection only appear in Daniel 12:2. What do you say? Ideas thinking about the resurrection literally only appears in Daniel 12:2, which says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt." That is the single resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. But the rest of the Old Testament does not make a clear distinction between where the wicked and the righteous go after or in death. Daniel 12 becomes important for intertestamental developments. It becomes important for what happens in the New Testament. But it's interesting that resurrection only appears there in Daniel 12 because they're pretty much thinking when you go to Sheol, you're kind of there in a shadowy, inactive, unconscious sort of existence. Boys and men, we are told, suffer from ADD, attention deficit disorder, more than do women. Partly, I believe that ADD is just part of being male in a modern society. Men like to do things, to be active. Men aren't as good as sitting and listening to conversation or lectures for as long or as well as women. Anyway, I'm going to begin calling these show interruptions ADD moments, because none of us can pay attention for too long. So here's today's ADD moment. I love living in southern Idaho. The people are friendly, kind, and overwhelmingly considerate. I've had complete strangers come up to me in the grocery store and ask me if I need help, and they don't even work there. They just want to be kind. But there's one malingering issue that presses my crazy button. Driving. People. A few years ago, in fact, I think it was precisely in 2016, the automotive industry came up with a new invention. They call it a turn signal. It's almost always on the left side of your steering column, and if you will use that, I'll be way less likely to pull out in front of you on some country road. Yeesh! Turn signal. All right, that's the end of that first ADD moment, officially so. Belief in the resurrection, we left off at Daniel 12:2. Belief in the resurrection really begins to be developed and embraced during the intertestamental period, and I'll talk about that in a couple important reasons why that may have happened in my next episode. But something enormous had changed because by the New Testament times, belief in the resurrection was common among Pharisees and many other Jews. But let me reiterate. Daniel 12:2, and Daniel's written in the 6th century BC, and possibly Isaiah 66:24, which is 8th century BC. Those two are the only evidence in the belief of the afterlife as a place of eternal torment and judgment for the wicked, and Daniel 12 is unique for its opening up the first time on resurrection. Daniel 12 says, "And they shall go forth and look upon the corpses of the men who have conspired against me, for their worm does not die, and their fire is not quenched. They shall be an abhorrence to all flesh." Here we get a notion of judgment, eternal torment in the afterlife, and obviously Jesus will quote that verse centuries later. Well, given that the Old Testament does not really emphasize existence in the afterlife, what does this say about the ancient Jewish worldview? It shows us that the ancient Hebrews thought about their God as the source of life. The Hebrews emphasized life, not death. It was important to them to live a good life, to have as many children as possible, and to die a peaceful death. Deuteronomy 30:19 nicely sums all this up when it says, "Now choose life, for Yahweh is your life." Job 12:10 takes us in that broad Jewish orientation when it says, "In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being." Genesis 1 and 2 shows God as the source of all life. And centuries later, Jesus reflected this attitude when he said in Mark 12:27, He is God, not of the dead, but of the living. Still, even though Jesus is thinking eschatologically, afterlifedly, he's thinking about God and life, not God and death. Or, to put it still more in a Jewish frame, the name Yahweh comes from the verb to be. When God says to Moses in Exodus 3:14, I am who I am, God is emphasizing this life-oriented characteristic. So, what was the Old Testament saying about death and what happens after death? Not much. Sometimes Old Testament passages assert that there is being after death, or consciousness after death, or semi-consciousness after death, but most of the time the view into the netherworld is foggy. The netherworld in the Old Testament is shadowy and hard to know, and the ancient Jews' descriptions of the netherworld are shadowy and difficult. But there is little to zero belief in a happy state of bliss following death. Again, Daniel 12 alone holds out the hope in resurrection. Next episode, we'll look at how resurrection developed in the intertestamental period. But even if we consider the moral cast, the moral character of the Old Testament, we see that that too goes toward the day-to-day, this life orientation of ancient Jewish life. Their emphasis was on this life, not on a life to come. And that realization is fascinating to me, since I am so convinced there is a life to come. The Old Testament puts its weight on this life. Jesus, if you read him carefully, he does too. He's insistent that what we do with this life matters, but he will extend that to say what we do with this life matters for eternity. So Jesus represents an enormous shift from the when you die you go to the grave, whatever that means. He represents an enormous shift in imagination with respect to death and the afterlife. If you want a succinct article on Jewish beliefs about the afterlife today, I encourage you to go to www.myjewishlearning.com/article/heaven-and-hell-in-Jewish tradition. myjewishlearning.com, because there's a lot of foggy, shadowy belief among believing Jews today in the afterlife. Before I sign off, you guys, please listen to this entire series and not just today's episode. And I'm not just saying that so you'll listen to the series and cause my huge numbers to go up. I'm saying that this episode is important in order to characterize how outlandish, how beautifully outlandish will be Jesus' common teaching, and the common teaching that characterized the apostles after Jesus, and both of that has to do with being raised from the dead. It is a glorious contrast indeed. Thanks so much for listening, and turn your brains on, everybody.